Hi, thanks for joining me today on the Heart in a Drawer podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of loneliness for the first time on one of these podcasts. And I don't even have to ask you, as a child of divorce, if you've dealt with this problem, because I know for certain that you have. So the angle we're going to discuss today is how we handle loneliness in negative ways, what that costs us, and how we can ask God to help us handle it differently. So one of the best books I've read about being a child of divorce is The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce. And this is a 25-year study published in the year 2000 that talks about the long-term damage that divorce does to children. And I read this probably around 2010, and I found so much affirmation in it. If you want an in-depth, scientifically based look at the effects of divorce, I can't think of a better book to recommend. But today I'm going to focus on the chapter that is about growing up lonely. That's the title of the chapter. And it's making the case that the studies have shown that the younger a child is when their parents divorce, the harder it is on them and the worse that their loneliness is. But I can say that I think loneliness is going to set in no matter which age that you were when your parents divorced. But for now in this discussion, we're going to talk about if it happened to you when you were very young. Like I was 4 when my parents first divorced. And it says, people ask me all the time if there's a best time to get a divorce. Isn't it easier? They wonder if the child is still very young and won't have strong memories of the intact family. Or is it better to wait until children are nearly grown with one foot out of the nest? Does the age of the child matter? And should people contemplating divorce wait for a better time? The answer, of course, is it depends on a host of factors. And then it says, that said, it is clear from my work and others that in our divorce culture, the youngest children tend to suffer the most. It says in many families, this includes infants or toddlers who may have been tenderly cared for and suddenly experience a drastic change in that care. So this is one of the sentences from this book that has stood out most to me, and I feel like captured my feelings better than anything else, quite frankly. So in this chapter, she goes through a case study of a woman named Paula whose parents divorced when she was very young. And then on page 168, it says, years later, Paula and other children who are very young when their parents divorced remember one thing most: a vast, unsoothable sense of loneliness. They're angry about being left so much to themselves. They know that their parents were overwhelmed by their own changed circumstances, but that's not grounds for forgiveness. And we're going to talk about forgiveness in future broadcasts, but for now we're going to just sit in that place where a young child feels a sense of great injustice when their parents divorce. And it says, later it says, their feelings of loneliness and anger at both parents carried over into later school years and adolescence. At the 25-year mark, now these children are between 28 and 32 years old. They are doing less well in the workplace and in relationships compared with children who were older at the time of the breakup. They have a lower level of confidence, about their chances of marrying successfully and are more worried about being betrayed. And then they go into the reasons why this is. The primary researcher on this is Judith Wallerstein. And she's talking about one of the headings in here is called the motherless child. And she says, it is one of the cruel paradoxes of this and many divorces, especially for the preschool children, that the more the mother gained, the more her children lost. The mother's advances in education and in employment, and her very human need for adult love and play all enhanced her life and took her more and more away from the lives of her children. I just want to comment on that from my own experience. So I've told you I have a photographic memory, and I can remember everything really about those really painful experiences. My mom was a stay-at-home mom before the divorce, and she suddenly had to get a job at the hospital that required her to get up very, very early in the morning and work some swing shifts. And that was very, very difficult for me. And then once she found a job that was more of a 8 to 5 kind of situation, she became very heavily involved in church ministry, in lay ministry, and had many activities in the weeknights. And then she also started dating, and like this book is saying, that's very normal. But for me, that was so hard. Just a year or so, maybe 2 years after the divorce, I was still grieving over the loss of normalcy, my father being there, and then having to get used to boyfriends, and then high school students in our home practicing for music. That's the kind of ministry my mom was leading. It was just too much for me to process, and I felt like I was lost in the shuffle. And I know that my mom didn't intend for that to happen, but she was moving on with her life, and I didn't feel ready to move along in that same format. And it was very difficult for me to go through all of those changes, not only because I was entering kindergarten and going through those changes myself. It was just a lot of transition and just too much for me to really handle. And I'm going to continue on with what the book says for a few different places. It says that the focus of divorce policy and intervention has centered on the loss of the father, which is profound for many divorced children, definitely in my case too. But the loss of a mother pervades and forever changes the way a child, especially a young child, experiences the world. And it says 25 years later, these case study subjects cried as they remembered, my mother was really not there. No one was there. And that's sad, and I can identify with that feeling. Even though she was there in my life, she wasn't available to me like she was when she was a stay-at-home mom. That was a terrible loss, and I didn't have the capabilities of knowing how to grieve that loss and get past it. And I think that it's just a lot to go through as a young child, but I feel like when I reflect on the second divorce that occurred when I was 22 years old, my dad moved 100 miles north with this new marriage, and it was hard for our family to have that loss as well. And it was strange that even though I was a new wife, I had just gotten married, that sense of loneliness kind of carried over into that next relationship as well. And again, I thought that I could handle it so much better as a young adult than I could at 4 years old with the first time around. But I was surprised at how that loneliness still affected me decades later. So I wanted to talk about the negative ways that we children of divorce cope with that unprocessed grief and that anger and that frustration and injustice that we feel. And we can cope with it in different ways. And I'm thinking of us as children mostly, not as young adults. But I think for me, what I've written about on my blog is overeating and comforting myself with food. And of course, that made me an overweight child, and that cost me socially, and people made fun of me about it. Adults kept nagging me about doing the right thing, so it did cost me. But it was a sure way for me to feel good, at least for a few minutes, when I was enjoying a favorite food. And by the time I was in high school, I was binge eating. And I was I'm not really sure because I didn't weigh myself at the time, but I was morbidly obese. I was in that really dangerous category. And one of the reasons that I ate that much is because I didn't want the attention of boys at the time. I think it's secretly inside I wanted it, but I had been hurt. I was confused by things that were going on in my family, and I wanted to keep boys at a distance. I write about that in my book, Transforming Your Thought Life. And I write about that in the Regretful Thoughts chapter about keeping a certain boy at arm's length distance because I didn't know how to process that kind of attention because I hadn't received it in a healthy way from my parents. I think another common way, whether you overeat or undereat, that could be a way that you handled it as a child. Another way that we don't really talk about much, but I think that porn is something that many of us were exposed to as a young child, or maybe elementary school, junior high school. And that was a way of feeling good, again, just for maybe a few minutes, or indulging in some kind of private activity that kind of offset that pain and caught us in its trap. And I remember, again, I've written about this in my book. I just feel like it's better to be open and honest about this because it's never going to get solved in our lives if we keep it a secret. And so I've decided to go first in some of these difficult subjects because I want people to know that they're not alone in these struggles. So when I was in college, I kind of was indulging in looking at soft porn. And I talk about that in my book. And I talk about what an easy trap that is to fall into. And I'm a woman, and I know that many people think that's just a man's problem, or primarily a man's problem, but it's becoming more and more of a problem among females, and especially younger generations. But I don't think it's only a problem for Gen Z. I think that it was a problem for many of us Gen Xers. We didn't have it on the internet necessarily, but we had ways of getting our hands on it, or being unwittingly exposed to it. That's the story of someone very close to me who's a child of divorce. Came upon it as a child because it was in their parents' home, and then it has affected their view of sexuality ever since. And that's really sad because, really just one experience with it as a child can create that kind of addiction. And I know it took me quite a while to get past that temptation and break free from it. And I was only able to do that with God's help. And I know that if you're struggling with that, it's going to take a lot of prayer and accountability and putting some other things into play to get past it. But you can get past it because I did myself. Any of these things that I'm bringing up today, there are things you can do to overcome, just like my overeating that I talked about. I have a lot more mindful eating plan now. And some other things that we do to cope now, I think, as adults, would be drinking. It's kind of this cliche to say that you're gonna, you need more wine to just relax or whatever. And I know that the pandemic has really made this a big problem for people, whether you were a problem drinker or not. Maybe you are turning to alcohol as a really easy way to escape the hard feelings that you're dealing with. And I can tell you from my own experience that alcoholism has been a terrible plague in my family. And in my book, I call it, I say that it stands at the doorway of all of my deepest hurts. And so I mindfully chose not to unlock that DNA code that's in me, to have a propensity toward alcohol addiction, because I have seen just how horribly damaging it is. And yet I have great compassion for people who are caught up in that, because I have had so many loved ones who have been caught in that trap and really are still in denial that they're in that trap. And the ones that I'm thinking of in my life are all children of divorce. Each one of them that are in my mind, their faces are flashing before me right now, that have serious alcohol problems, are children of divorce. And I think for them, it's just been easier to turn to that to kind of numb themselves, rather than go back and deal with that pain from when they felt rejected and alone and scared as little children. So I think these are just a few things, how we eat, if we drink alcohol or take drugs, and if we indulge in porn. These are very, very common coping mechanisms in the American culture and worldwide, of course. But I think they're not healthy and they're not anything that we really want to do. But I think it's human nature to try to escape that crushing pain and that void of that vast, unsoothable sense of loneliness that we experience as children of divorce. So, one thing I want to do to bring us some hope into this situation is we need a starting point for healing. And I think that there's a really good, very basic prayer in Scripture that we can use. But it's at the same time, it's very challenging, and it's also very life-giving. And this book, Dangerous Prayers, is my favorite book that I've read so far in 2020, and I read over 100 books a year. So that's saying a lot. That's high praise. But this book is so simple, and yet it's so profound in its truths, and it has such good practical application. So I want to read a little portion of it that I think pertains to this discussion on how we handle loneliness in poor ways as children of divorce and what we can do about it. So the first prayer of these dangerous prayers is, "Search me." And it is from Psalm 139, 23, and 24. And I'm going to read it to you. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." That is a bold prayer. It's a dangerous prayer because it's got such potential to change us. And it's also a prayer of hope. It's asking God to lead us in the way of everlasting and to deliver us from our loneliness. So I want to read something that Craig Groeschel says here. He's putting it in, he's talking about how we tend to rationalize our problems, our overeating or our alcohol use or any of these other poor choices that we do to fill up that void of loneliness or hurt. And he says, "Have you ever done this? You tell yourself what you believe is true in your heart. I won't eat much, I promise, just a couple of bites. And then the next thing you know, you're holding an empty bag of chips or licking the pan clean." I've done that. We all rationalize. No one likes to face the ugly truth that they drink too much, that they think about things that they'd be ashamed for anyone else to know, that they laugh at others' mistakes and gossip behind their backs. And the rationalizations continue. You tell yourself, "I'm not materialistic. I just like nice things. I'm not a gossip. I'm just telling them so that they can pray. I don't have a problem. This is just my one thing I do to cope." Now listen to this. This is important, and I gain a lot of affirmation from this. I bet David was tempted to cope when he was running for his life from Saul. He could have used alcohol to escape. He could have turned angry, resentful, and bitter. Or David could have plotted to harm King Saul, justifying his actions in the name of self-preservation. But instead of taking the easy path, David chose a more daring one. The man after God's own heart decided to pray, knowing that his own heart was capable of tricking him again and again. Without Christ, your heart is deceitful. That's why this prayer of David's is crazy dangerous. Search my heart, Lord. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to ask God to search us. Not only to search us for the poor choices that we make to cope with this loneliness that we have, but to search us and reveal the roots. Go all the way back down to, why do I do this? What are my triggers? What do I feel when I need to turn to those things? Am I the little girl sitting in my bedroom at my door, peeking out, watching my mom interact with all these high school students when I wanted her to interact with me? Is that where I am? Is that where I'm feeling lonely and afraid and small and unimportant and overlooked? And is that when I want to reach for a bag of M&Ms and cram handfuls of them into my mouth? Maybe so. But the good news is that when we ask God to search us, He's going to come sit beside us in those moments where those lonely feelings triggered, where they started. And he's going to put his arm around us and he's going to say, "You're not alone. I was with you the whole time." That's how I started to heal, and that's how you can heal too. Now, in the next episode, we're going to talk about some healthy ways that you can deal with your loneliness now that may have been affecting you for 20, 30 years, and you never really realized that it was connected to being a child of divorce. But I am going to tell you some things you can do to cope. So I hope you'll join me for that next time. So if you're listening to this podcast, I would love for you to go rate and review it, because that can help more people find it. And if you're watching this on YouTube, would you just take a moment to like or comment on this video and share it with someone who could benefit from it? Because I want to help as many people as I can find the healing and hope that they need as adult children of divorce, and you can help me do that. So be sure to go to the show notes, because I'm going to have links to all of these resources I've shared with you today, plus a free printable worksheet that you can use to meditate on God's Word and reflect on some questions to gain closeness with Him this week. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'm praying God's peace for you. Just remember, you can go to the comments and go to my contact page and send me an email, and I'd be happy to pray for you. I'd be honored to do that in your healing journey. So God's blessings and peace to you until we meet again. Bye-bye.